In middle school, I was placed in college prep courses, and at that time, that meant going to another set of classes and being engaged with another set of students. None of my friends were in those classes, and suddenly I was the raisin in the milk. I was the only African American in a sea of white students. I didn't have a name for it at the time, but what I started to do was act one way at school and another way at home. I began to do what we call code switching. So at home, I would have smoked barbecue and boiled crabs and Cuban sandwiches. And at school, I would have kind of these overprocessed free lunch, whatever that looked like. At home, I sang in the gospel choir in my church, and at school, I sang in the choral ensemble. At school, I had to get involved in some type of organized sport, so I got involved in volleyball. And it was during that time when I got involved in volleyball that I actually had my first experience of being called a nigger. I was outside practicing, and a truckload of young white men passed by and just yelled out, "Go home, nigger." And it caught me off guard. And it wasn't that I hadn't heard the word before. It's just that I hadn't heard the word used against me like a weapon. And I didn't tell anyone. I was out there by myself. I didn't tell my coach. I didn't tell my teammates. I didn't tell my parents. I just took it as I'm a black person growing up in America. At some point or another, someone's going to use that word against me. And this was simply my turn. I began to place all these kind of lessons. I started to store them as mental checks for my future and for my children's future. I knew that the only way I would get into college, for instance, was with scholarships. I didn't really have a sense of how much I would need. I just knew that there wasn't anything at home that would support going to college in terms financially support going to college. So it meant that when it came time to apply for financial aid, I had to ask my parents a lot of personal, intimate questions that I'd never asked them before. There was an elderly white man named Mr. Morgan would come by the house to get a payment, a monthly payment. And again, I didn't know what he was doing there. He was out of place, obviously, in a black and Cuban neighborhood, but I know now that he was probably a predatory lender. I went to the University of Florida, which actually my code switching prepared me quite well for. It was a predominantly white campus, diverse in its to some extent, but still a predominantly white campus. I stayed, if you can believe it, I stayed in a non-air-conditioned hall in Florida, where there was actually a good mix of people. And my roommate, her name was Susan Denise Johnston. My name is Susan Danita Johnson. So when you see the names on the door, you think, did they make a mistake? Why is my name up there twice? They didn't. There was a young white woman from Fort Pierce. I could tell she hadn't spent a lot of time or lived or been around black people a lot, but she asked a lot of questions about my hair. She asked a lot of questions about kind of my background, and I was happy to provide it. It wasn't the first time a white person had asked me about my hair, and it definitely wasn't the last. The University of Florida was a really huge campus, so it was, while I had the ability to code switch, the enormity of the campus was a little bit to get used to, but when I stepped on a college campus, I knew that I always wanted to be a part of a college campus. I loved it. I loved the people, I loved the interactions, I loved the different opportunities I had. It was like, I don't know what I'm gonna do professionally, I'm gonna figure it out, but it's always gonna be about college. And that became very clear to me early on. While in my psychology program, about 2 years in, I was writing my thesis at the time actually, and another professor in another department, still psychology, just another discipline within psychology, he came to me just out of the blue and asked why I hadn't received a particular fellowship. And I had no idea what he was talking about. He said, well, there's a number of other, black graduate students that have this fellowship, and I noticed on the list that your name wasn't there. And so I went to my advisor, who was a newly minted tenure track professor, black woman. And she had no clue either. So ended up going to the chair to ask, why wasn't Susan receiving this particular fellowship? And his response was, well, I want all the students in my department to be on equal footing. And when my advisor came back and told me that, immediately I thought, we didn't come into the program on equal footing. The student whose parents bought her the car and paid for her off-campus apartment, we weren't on equal footing. I wasn't on equal footing with the student that was a part of the chair's undergraduate research team. I wasn't on equal footing with the students that thought it was okay to be servers at another professor's wedding, unpaid servers for free. And they were fine with that, and they didn't see a reason why anyone would be upset or be concerned about what that would look like for a black student serving at a white professor's wedding for free. So I chose to leave the department and actually ended up getting another master's in student personnel and counselor education, which was my outside concentration, and it was great. All the things I did outside the classroom, who knew there was a degree in it and you could work? So my dream to be a part of a college campus, I realized it because of turning to this other discipline in a time of kind of stress and not necessarily knowing where I was going to go. And it ended up being the best choice I ever made.